Hi everyone, thank you very much for stopping by and returning to the old world. We've now had a few days since the frenzy and madness that was pre-order day, and have had time to reflect on some of the information that has been released through the various battle reports, either on Warhammer Plus, if you're a subscriber, or on YouTube. And that brings me to the topic of today's conversation, which is Step Up and its seeming demise from Warhammer the Old World. So for those that maybe didn't play Warhammer Fantasy, Step Up is a rule that came into existence in 8th edition. Before that, when a unit charged another, the charging unit got to fight first in combat, and if it took out enough models to remove the opponent's front rank, then the side that was charged didn't get to strike back. A unit champion would always be the last model removed from a unit, however, but it could be specifically targeted. This made it possible for an entire front rank to be removed and no strikes back to be achieved. After the charging turn, combat was resolved in initiative order. So what this meant is when a unit got charged, there was a good chance it would be relying on static combat resolution to keep it in the fight. So having a banner, having rank bonuses, things like that. Now that changed in 8th edition. Surviving models were able to step up, advance into the front rank, or in Old World parlance, the fighting rank, and then they got to fight. So this meant that blocks of heavy infantry with a lot of depth suddenly had a bit more of a clout in that first round of combat, because they would always get to swing back with something. No matter how many casualties they took, if something survived the combat, there was going to be some dice rolled in your favour. And that was something that really changed the game of Warhammer. So in the editions before 8th edition, certainly looking at 5th, 6th, 7th, speed was really important, and the ability to charge meant that armies consisted of lots of cavalry and would have lots of monstrous infantry, where those monstrous infantry units had a higher speed than your average infantryman, which would normally be typically a movement of 4 in the elves movement of 5, because a charge was double your movement allowance, and it was all guess range because there was no pre-measuring. Fundamentally what this meant is large infantry units, they tended to struggle, they tended to be equipped defensively, so as much armour as you could slap on them, shields, getting as much of an armour save, trying to survive that initial attack. And it seems that this is the world we're very much going back to with the release of Warhammer Old World and the lack of the step-up rule. And when we take into account some of the special rules we've seen, for example the Bretonnians, with their cavalry being able to ignore rank bonuses for their first charge of the game, that means that that big infantry block, if it's charged, has even less to fall back on and is more likely to be routed because it doesn't have as many points of combat resolution and may not get to fight back at all. So I think this raises some interesting questions for the game and what armies might look like, and obviously only time can tell when it comes to this. The obvious prediction to make here is the return to cavalry hammer, where armies make as much use of cavalry, flying creatures, monstrous infantry, stuff that's fast and hits hard, using that as much as they can. Then there's also some other issues, such as screening. Screening's always been important in Warhammer, helping you preventing charges against units you don't want to get charged, setting up traps, things like that. And I think that's going to become even more important than it was in 8th edition, going back to sort of really how it was in 6th, 7th edition. Being able to put a line of light infantry or light cavalry between the units you really want to be getting the charges in, particularly if you're an infantry heavy army like the dwarves, for example, and those enemy units. Trying to bait charges to get units into positions where you can charge them. One of the problems with 8th edition is Warhammer. The rules are with steadfast, which basically meant units that had more ranks were pretty much not running anywhere, no matter whether they won the combat or lost it. And step up meant that hordes became really common. You saw units 40, 50, 60 models strong. And I do wonder whether actually the lack of step up is Games Workshop's way of trying to challenge this kind of army building. A lot's been said that 8th edition just wasn't an accessible game, and this is one of the big problems that it had for attracting new players and also getting players to invest in new armies, because you just needed so many models of the same type, having to buy, say, 5 boxes of models just to field a single unit. And that meant it wasn't fun to plough through it all. It cost a lot of money to do so, hence all of the issues. Now, in the various articles we've seen, Games Workshop have said it's up to the player how wide the formations go, but we also know that formations can't be deeper than they are wide, and that is something we used to see in 8th edition. We used to see units such as Skaven Slaves, for example, being 5 models wide, and they'd be about 10 ranks deep, ensuring they had steadfast. They were just a giant tar pit that would hold down an enemy unit pretty much for the entire game. And that wasn't a massive fun, to be honest, and there wasn't an awful lot you could do because there'd be 2 or 3 of those units against you on the tabletop. Zombies for vampire counts being another good example. So I do wonder if Games Workshop are, in a way, trying to lead us to an MSU style of play, or at least a mixture of multiple small units backed by a couple of larger bricks. Again, this takes me back to how Warhammer used to be played, where units would be 20 to 30 models at the absolute largest, and you'd get a number of small 5, 10 model units floating around as well, particularly with cavalry. But what, pray tell, about Gunlines? Is that the way of dealing with the lack of step up, etc.? And if you've got an army that's slow moving, heavy infantry, is that the way to even the odds? Now, the early suggestions are that that might not be the way forward, because a quick army is going to be on you turn 2, turn 3. And that's probably not giving you enough time for a gunline to take out enough models, break enough units to be viable. And particularly when we look at things like cannon now looking like they are weaker than they were in previous editions of the game, making it more difficult to do that significant damage where you need it to be. All this very much does leave me to think that we're going to see some very different strategies to how we saw 8th edition, and deployment, placement of models, and then movement is really going to be elevated to the fore of the game. It's been one of my predictions for a little while now, as we've seen more and more information come out during the Almanac articles. But I definitely think that the high-level gameplay we're going to see, it's going to be a real war of movement in order to get the most beneficial charges in and to gain control of those combat phases, which is where games are going to be won and lost, with victory conditions looking like they're going to be around breaking enemy units and taking them out completely. So what do you think about Step Up being removed? Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not entirely sure. It is a rule I liked with 8th edition, but I think its removal again is merely something that is different, and it forces us to think differently and change our tactics, or learn new tactics, as the case may be. Do let me know in the comments below. All that remains for me to say is thank you very much for listening. I am returned to the old world. Have a great day.